ended up working for Frank Field in the first Blair government, right? So that's how old I am. And whenever I come back to the UK now and I meet young think tankers and I tell them I worked in the first Blair government, wow. And then, as you quite rightly said, I ended up as Nick Clegg's Director of Strategy in the coalition government. So it's interesting, that phrase, like not many people oppose the idea of pro-social masculinity. That sounds good, right? It's pro, right? It's pro-social. Of course, it presumes there is such a thing as masculinity, which maybe we'll get into, but I've had a little bit of pushback against the kind of, for a post-feminist world, especially from feminists. And what I mean by that is for a more gender equal world. Now, it is the problem with the phrase post-feminist is that some people have interpreted it saying job done. Okay, we're post-feminism now, and the correct response to that from some is to say, well, not quite. Right? There's still a bunch of things still to do, and so I'm happy to slightly adjust the terminology, but I'm going to stand by the basic statement, which is that there has been this just transformation in the economic relationships between men and women in the last 40, 50 years. If you look at the UK now, women track men in earnings through the 20s. I think 40% of women earn more than their partners, etc. Huge change. I mean, just in the last 40, 50 years, just a spectacular achievement. And it was, of course, the central goal of post-war women's movement, which was to secure economic independence. As Gloria Steinem and Margaret Mead and others famously said, the point is to turn marriage or even a relationship into a choice, not a necessity. And I think that to a very large degree that has been achieved, partly and mostly through changes in the labour market. That's of course been driven by this huge overtaking in education. One of the most extraordinary facts I think about OECD countries is that in every single OECD country there are more young women with a college degree than men. Because you only have to go back to when I was in college and there were more men. I was in college in the late 80s and it was 45% women. When I was born in 69 it was less than 30% women. Now it's 60% women in the US and 60% in the UK, almost 60% in the UK. If you look at those graduating from secondary school in the UK, 40% of the girls graduating from secondary school go straight to college, 29% of the boys do. That's a big gap. And that's something that like no one expected back in the 70s, that there would be this, not only this catching up, this huge overtaking. That's obviously driven huge gains in the labour market, some of which I've just referred to, which means that whilst the gender pay gap still exists, it is now largely a parenting pay gap. And we have very good evidence on that. One of the great things about being able to attract more single-sex couples is that you can see that the same sorts of dynamics about earnings affect same-sex couples as heterosexual couples. And so that allows us to see quite clearly, and there's lots of other evidence too, that basically women's and men's earnings track each other pretty well until about late 20s, early 30s, when the women's line, something happens to the women's earnings line. It goes kaboom. It's like a meteorite hits it. And the men's doesn't. That thing is children. And so we still have this hugely different impact of having children on earnings. So huge progress, as you say, economically, and we can obviously talk about some more of the numbers. The result of that, I think, and this is why I ended up sticking my neck out a little bit to write about this book, and we can talk a bit more about the politics of it, I'm sure we will, is that there are consequences to those sorts of massively positive, wonderful, liberating changes that we need to take seriously. And here, there's been this dislocation, especially of working class men, from their traditional roles. So by definition, if women achieve economic independence, wonderful, great thing. Like, as you mentioned, I'm J.S. Mill's biographer, right? So I'm all about this. But we should be responsible about the fact that if we're going to fundamentally change that such an important factor in our social life, such as the economic relationship between women and men, we shouldn't expect it to be all plain sailing. And I think we're seeing some of the cultural reaction and responses to a failure to take seriously the difficulties of men as a result of some of these changes. That's coincided, and I'll stop talking a minute, that's coincided, of course, with the trends that you know well, Adam, deindustrialization, etc., which has really hit working class men's wages very hard. So you've got, this is the group I'm most worried about, who have seen both their relative status dropping quite quickly, but also in many cases their absolute economic status. That's very dislocating, very disorienting, and I think culturally difficult. And we have not been well served by a political culture that I think has generally failed to take this problem seriously, for different reasons. I think that on the left there's been a reluctance to even engage in this discussion. That's one of the reasons I'm talking about it. And on the right, when it is talked about, it sometimes takes on the flavour of what David Willits once famously called bring-backery. He said the thing about conservatism, it usually does, in the end, it comes. You have to watch for the bring-backery. It's bring back whatever the thing is. The thing you're bringing back varies, but it's always bring back something. And in this case, it's bring back the traditional family, bring back the way the world used to be, and that's a profound moral and empirical error. But what's right about the conservative concern here is to say, look, there are consequences. We have to be responsible about so profoundly changing social institutions and not attending to the byproducts of that. And there's a reason why suicide is the biggest killer of British men under the age of 45. There is something going on here. And Fiona Shand, who did some work published in the BMJ with her colleagues on suicide in UK, Australia, I think somewhere else, they asked men, they tracked to see which words men had used to describe themselves before suicide or attempted suicide. And the top two words that those men used to describe themselves were worthless and useless. So there's something going on there where if we actually do create an economy or a society where certain groups of people start to feel they have no worth or no use, then it's perhaps not surprising that we have some of the cultural problems that we have too. I've looked at all this through the lens of not only as policy, but also a father, as you mentioned. I've raised 3 boys to their 20s in both the UK and the US, so lived a little bit of this. And as I say at the beginning of the book, I've spent the last 25 years worrying about 3 boys. Now I'm worried about millions of boys and men, and our failure to take seriously the problems that they're facing.
So I want to ask about family policy, because at Onward we've just started a mini smoke paper on childcare, and as you start thinking about the problem from a fairly technical lens, what's the subsidy route, how complex are the schemes, you quite quickly get to pretty tricky questions about what do we want families to look like, or what do we think an optimum family might be, and that gets you in a very tricky territory, because you move from a kind of neutral policy judgment into quite a normative social one. And there's a David Willits quote actually in your book, which is great. So we get double David Willits, very wonky discussion. Yeah. It says, a welfare system that was originally designed to compensate men for loss of earnings is slowly and messily redesigned to compensate women for the loss of men.
Yeah, he can write too, can't
he? Can really write.
Yeah, that's really good.
And what does it look like to have a policy framework that compensates for the loss of men? And that's obviously a sort of a particularly poetically phrased term, but as men change, what does family policy need to be in order to compensate for that?
Yeah, well, what I go on to say is that another way of putting it is that the welfare system has, over time, adjusted itself to take very seriously the support of children, and therefore of the people who tend to be looking after the children, which is still disproportionately women. And so if you have a situation, so to some extent, if there's a bit of a chicken and egg here, right? And so conservatives would focus on the impact of changes in welfare on family life, and those of a more liberal orientation would say the changes in family life were the result of much broader cultural changes and the economic changes I've referred to before. And so we ain't going to bring back the old kind of marriage that women were sometimes had little choice, honestly, but to enter into. And so if we're interested in looking after the kids, and the kids are increasing with mums, and some of those mums are on their own, we better give them money. And then of course people say, Abby, if you do that, you reduce the incentives to get married. And so you are in something of a vicious circle. I think there's real force to that concern. But I tend to the view that these changes are largely, they're here, they're permanent, and that we should now design family policy on the presumption of women's independence, of relationships like marriage as a choice, and as far as possible, shaping family policy in a way that gives equal attention to mothers and fathers, but does not presume that their parenting will be done through the institution of marriage. That's where I've had the most criticism from the right in the US, by the way. That's really where I'm kind of, because I'm as far as men are concerned, I'm father forward, not marriage forward. I think it's through parenting, it's through fatherhood, and so I regret now that when we were in the coalition, I was one of the people arguing very strongly that parental leave should be fully transferable. I now think that was a mistake. I think it was a good liberal way to take it, but I now think unless we have some paid leave which is specifically attached to fathers, that we won't be supporting fatherhood as the kind of institution I think we need. So you're right to say there's normative questions here, and I'm glad you said that, because we can spend a lot of time sort of twiddling around with taper rates and subsidies for childcare and not do what you just did, is take a step back and say, hold on, what kind of families do we want? But as soon as we're saying that, we should really check ourselves, of course, and say, well, we want the kind of families that people want. And as far as possible, policy should support that, which is in contradiction to what I just said about having use it or lose it leave for fathers. That's a slightly illiberal policy.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say in the book, I've changed my mind on this at least twice that I can think of in the course of my career. So I might change my mind about it again. But for the moment, I'm so worried about fatherlessness. I'm so worried about the way that the breakup of the parents' relationship so often predicts the attenuation or disappearance of the relationship between the father and the kids, that I want to lean incredibly hard into fatherhood.
So on father, we did some work recently in Oldham, and we were speaking to a community group that kind of ran this big village hall, and one of the groups that came there were a single dad support group called Men Behaving Dadly, which I thought was a wonderful name.
That's great.
And one of the things they talked about was they needed a space where dads could basically get together and share, particularly single dads, get together and share quite how difficult they were finding, kind of being both parents, but even just performing the father role.
Yeah.
And I guess there is a real nervousness, and I understand this in the UK in terms of family policy, around anything that looks like a parenting class, right? So Sure Start was a way to have support for parents without overtly calling it that, but anything that looks like telling people how to raise their kids, there's an understandable aversion to that. When it comes to fathers and fatherhood and the need to encourage kind of positive norms in dads and the work they do with their time they spend with their kids, is there a role for the state there? Is there something that the state should be doing, or is that for culture, communities? Is that something that's not necessarily right for public policy?
Well, I love the fact you've mentioned parenting, because it's an area that I've done quite a bit of work in, and I think there is some pretty good evidence that actually you can get better at it through appropriate learning. And so I understand the concern that people have around it. It's even worse in the US, by the way, that kind of visceral reaction to telling parents how to parent is how it would be framed. It's also striking that, of course, that I remember trying to explain to my parents what parenting was. When I became a father, I said, we were going to a parenting class, and my dad looked at me and said, what's parenting? What's that word, parenting? I said, parenting, the verb to parent. He said, it's not a verb. Well, I said, what did you do? He said, well, we had kids. And I looked it up, and sure enough, parenting as a verb was invented in, I don't know, the 70s somewhere. You could do a little Googlegram for it. And so it suddenly became a verb. And I actually, honestly, this is a bit of off topic, but I sort of think that's when everything went wrong, in a way. It's like as soon as parent became a verb, we all got a bit too freaked out about it. So there is a problem of over-parenting, of course, at the top. But generally, so what's the role of policy? I think the role of policy is, as far as possible, to kind of maximise choice. So I don't think, it's a live issue in the US right now, I actually don't support only giving financial aid through child care subsidies rather. There is a kind of strong view, for single parents in particular, they should work. This is actually very Frank Field. This kind of sense of the whole welfare reform thing, it's that Clinton thing, it's still quite strong in quite a lot of policy circles, which is work good, therefore work. Therefore we'll subsidise childcare so you can work. But interestingly now, there's a growing movement that's uniting left and right, sort of Romney-type conservatives and sort of left Democrats around just giving people money rather than attaching it to childcare. And I'm on that side of the argument. I'm not sure I always would have been, but I'm on the side of the argument. Give them money. And then I think things like, we've talked about this, like leave for fathers, how unmarried fathers are treated in particular in the legal system, those things all matter. Because they can be nudges towards culture. I don't think that they are in and of themselves going to change culture very much. But I think there's something quite strong about this idea of fatherhood, which is both about policy, but it's also about where we talk about it. In between, and I'll simplify horribly for the purpose of the discussion, in between the sort of reluctance of some on the left to even discuss the fact that fathers might have a distinct role, and the attachment to marriage among some on the right leaves this big gap, which I call that gap fatherhood. I think there's a huge gap around promoting, supporting responsible and engaged fatherhood. So I think there's political space there too, in between sort of bring-backery of some of those on the right and the reluctance of some of those on the left for cultural reasons to say that fathers matter.
What I want to ask about boys in particular. So we did a report a little while ago called "The Kids Aren't All Right," which basically looked at the levels of loneliness, atomization, isolation amongst young people, and tried to dig down into some of the causes of that, and found a lot of stuff that others have identified. That Gen Z aren't quite as liberal as they are thought, that there's actually a lot of kind of illiberal or intolerance amongst that group, and attitudes towards things like being anti-democratic or wanting a strongman leader. And it's led us to think about what we need to do about boys, particularly boys that are isolated. Gaming, you talk about boys in Japan, who it's a whole kind of term for boys that are particularly isolated. There's a quote from the first headmaster of Stowe School, who describes his goals of cultivating men who would be acceptable at a dance and invaluable in a shipwreck, which I'm annoyed we didn't have for our report. The kids aren't all right, because that would have been a good policy goal. What does it mean to do that, to have boys that are, gifted at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck? How do you inculcate those values in young boys, and to what degree do you find some of the more common arguments, maybe around social media, gaming, around Reddit, are those persuasive? Are those good places to look to try and tackle some of these problems?
Yeah, it's great. I was actually asked on a podcast recently, someone gave me that quote and said, could you update that? Could you modernise it? Acceptable at a dance, invaluable in a shipwreck. And I went, well, I guess good at a rave, helpful. No, it's fine. It's good as it is. It's actually a great sentence, because it does capture something important about the permanent task of human societies of helping boys to become men and to generate mature masculinity. And one of the big motivations of the book is a real, and I feel incredibly uncomfortable with a lot of this material, and I take it as a general axiom that unless I'm uncomfortable with most of my work, I'm not doing very good work. So I just find a lot of this stuff really, really hard to talk about, even write about, which is I do think that a script for masculinity is important. And so what's captured in that is a sense of learning how to conduct yourself in society, right? So that is about relationships, friendships. It's also about dating. It's about treatment of women, etc. It's about engaging in society. But there's also the other element about invaluable in a shipwreck, which is, I think, does speak to something around courage, which is important. And that's physical courage in that case. And there's a reason why the Carnegie Foundation gives out Hero Medal Awards, which no one in the US knows about because they don't talk about it. It's 100 years old, and these are hero awards that go to civilians who risk or give their own lives to save the lives of another, not a member of their family, not in the course of their jobs. It's not for someone who's a responder or something. And the Carnegie Foundation has tried so hard to get more women on that list, they just can't. It's 95% men every year. 15-year-old boy runs into a burning, but these are real cases, burning building, saves a family, dies himself. 17-year-old boy dives into a river to save a family, dies himself. Just like year after year after year, you're just seeing this kind of, and they don't make a big deal of it because it's kind of weird, it's kind of uncomfortable, and sad. And I think it's great. I think it's it's not great that these people are dying, but it speaks to something that's a little bit different on average, and that's rather precious. And such is our debate about these things that we can't even talk about them. So invaluable in a shipwreck, absolutely. And so what does that mean? Or what it means in terms of social media is, it's playing out. I'd be interested to see if your report supports this. As you mentioned, I've done quite a lot with Jonathan Haidt. The way that I see the revolution that's taken place in internet technology, in information technology, is it's affected girls and boys very differently. So there's very good evidence that that social media in particular is really impacting Gen Z girls' mental health. I think John's work on this I think is really strong, and of course people like Jean Twenge and so on too. And that's because it's so relational, right? And relational bullying is something that, everything else equal, girls do a lot more of than boys, and so actually it just kind of creates quite a toxic environment. For boys, it's much more about it's less about that, less about the relational bullying online, more about where they go. And so I've been engaging quite a little bit with the alt-right debates around Andrew Tate, and I've written about Andrew Tate quite a bit. And the thing I was just doing before I came out here was Dr. Phil. And you have this guy on there, Rollo Tomasi, who's described as the godfather of the Red Pill movement. And he kept saying, I'm not an apologist for Andrew Tate, but then he kept apologising for Andrew Tate. Does everyone know who Andrew Tate is? You don't? How old are you? No, sorry. Well, you probably, do you have kids? No. Okay, fine. Because it's like, if you know anybody, but especially boys or men between the ages of 10 and 25, then you know who Andrew Tate was. Before he was deplatformed earlier in the summer, he had 12 billion views on TikTok. He's now been deplatformed off all the main social media platforms. And you can still see a little bit of what he's talking about, what he does, and he's kicked off from misogyny. And what he's basically doing is sort of Jordan Peterson without the restraint and the thoughtfulness, with muscles, no top, a tan, shades, short form video, weaponized for the algorithms of the internet of the current world, and he's spectacularly successful. And so the debate I was having yesterday was really about what do mums and dads do if their boys are looking at Andrew Tate, and first of all, we shouldn't freak out. We should try to understand what role he's playing, and what all the research on it suggests is he's providing some kind of script, some kind of way to be a man. Now, some of the stuff he says is okay, some of it's actually positive, but then it drifts into this horrible misogyny, which is why he got deplatformed. And what's striking about it is that the young men I've spoken to about it, they're usually able to distinguish between the two. But what it tells you is there's just this demand. And it's why one of the reasons I'm so concerned about fatherlessness, and why I'm so concerned about fathers when the parents aren't together, because what can then happen is it gets harder for boys to help to learn how to be men. And as I said at the beginning of this, and again, this is uncomfortable stuff, I think, but true, which is that masculinity is somewhat more socially constructed than femininity, somewhat more. But most important, and it's always been constructed. Margaret Mead said, and this is also in the book, she said, every known human society has rested on the learned, nurturing behavior of men. That behavior being learned is fragile and can disappear quite quickly in circumstances where it's no longer being taught. And I read that from the center. I read that and I'm like, yeah, Margaret, yeah, that's right. And I think that's what's happening now. I think what's happening now is that we have circumstances where this learned nurturing behavior is not being effectively taught. It's exposing the fragility of masculinity, and absent that, you create a vacuum that people like Andrew Tate are only too pleased to fill. And for those who don't know who Andrew Tate is, think of how people, like, he is basically Donald Trump to Jordan Peterson's George W. Bush. You know how when Donald Trump came in, all the liberals in the US suddenly got really dewy-eyed for George W. Bush. They're like, oh, he was so great, wasn't he? It's like, no, at the time, you thought he was the evil incarnate. But like, oh no, but by comparison to Trump. Well, that's what Tate is to Jordan Peterson. Everyone's now thinking, oh, Jordan Peterson, he's not so bad, you know, thoughtful professor. By comparison to Tate, that is, yeah.
And what does that mean for, so policy-wise, you know, putting on your kind of policy wonk hat or your DPN hat, does that mean that we should be kind of filtering or editing or monitoring these platforms? Does it mean we should have quite aggressive age verification, or is that just pushing against the tide?
Yeah, I think age verification and identity stuff is absolutely necessary. There's no question. That seems to me to be pretty low-hanging fruit. Well, how far it'll work is a different matter, but I think it's all very important to try and to signal our intent, and to help parents, and to be sort of signaling to parents as well. It's like, we get it, and you have a responsibility too. So by the government taking some responsibility, that signals to parents they should take some responsibility. And otherwise, I think I'm a little bit concerned about how far government should do this as opposed to trusting the providers. Mm-hmm. Andrew Tate is a great example, and again, I'm a liberal, right? I'm a million liberal, so I'm all about free speech. But his deplatforming really worked. I mean, he disappeared almost overnight. There's still little bits here and there, but it was extraordinary. He was everywhere. So from August onwards, Andrew Tate was being Googled 4 times more than recession. And he was the 3rd most Googled person in the world after Queen Elizabeth and Donald Trump. So this guy he's an absolute internet phenomenon. And because he'd mastered the algorithm, right? He's above the algorithm. There's this, Louise Perry has this lovely line saying, you're either above the algorithm or below it. Well, Andrew Tate was all above it. Mm-hmm. He was just an absolute genius at the algorithm. And a brilliant man, by the way. You wouldn't think it to see his videos, but you know, his father was a chess grandmaster, apparently. And so I see Tate as kind of doing something similarly brilliant, but with the algorithm rather than the chess set.
Okay. I'm going to ask one last question, then I'll open it up, which is possibly my most policy wonky one so far. It's about vocational education. So I had a little chat about this before.
Yes. You were the first person to ask me about the vocational education
you can
book.
Trust Onwards one to ask an apprenticeships question, don't you worry. So you talk about the persistent undervaluing of vocational learning that's been harmful in general, especially for boys and men, and you kind of decry classism, the cult of smart, all the rest of it. We've done a lot of work chatted to our researcher, Cheska, who's led all of this earlier on. We did a lot of work on apprenticeships, and we looked in a range of different ways. How is it by region changed? How is it in terms of social class, in terms of age, in terms of sector? We did not do it by gender. And now, interestingly, in the UK, the patterns to the US seem quite different. I think that's partly because apprenticeships are more common in different public services, which are kind of more balanced by gender than traditional kind of manual or technical roles. But I guess it'd be good to hear your thoughts on why the decline in vocational education has been such a challenge for boys and men, and what the solution to that is.
Yeah, so you're right. There are different patterns. So I think because apprenticeship has expanded, it's so much broader in the UK. It's expanded very significantly into these newer areas, as you say, in areas like healthcare and so on. In the US, because it actually hasn't expanded very much, and it's remained quite strongly within traditional trades. So it is in things like construction, manufacturing, HVAC, so kind of heating engineers, electrician, plumbing. I mean, those really do make up the bulk of apprenticeships in the US. So it's what people think apprenticeships are, right? If you ask people what they think apprenticeships are, they probably say things like that. But in the US, it is that. And so in the US, 93% of apprentices are male. And one of the reasons why the legislation that's to expand apprenticeships in the US has stalled in the Senate, it's been about a year, is because of this very policy wonky discussion about who registers them, whether it should be government registration or whether employers could certify. So then you're really into the weeds. But there's something else too, which is there's a bit of a resistance on the left because it's 93% male. So I've talked to some of the people who are involved around the Senate committee that's looking at it. They're saying, yeah, it's hard to get them excited about it when it's 93% men. And for me, that's a reason to get excited about it, given the extraordinary gaps in mainstream education that there are in the US now. I mean, the gap in getting a 4-year college degree in the US now is bigger than it was in 1972, which is when the US passed Title IX to promote women into education. It's flipped, so it's bigger now. So it's huge. So I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but there are many millions more women on college campuses than there are men. But apprenticeships is so tiny that the fact that it's 93% men should, in my view, seen as more of a feature than a bug. And because there are some differences on average in learning styles between boys and girls, and the boys do seem to benefit, everything on average, of course, a bit from applied learning, including vocational, then I actually think that I think we should see vocational training as an opportunity to create an overall learning system that's more balanced. The traditional education system is a bit more female-friendly than male-friendly, for all kinds of reasons that we might get into. And so if you have a vocational system that's alongside it, it doesn't seem to me to be a bad thing if that's somewhat more male-friendly than female-friendly. On average, again, you're still going to have plenty of people coming into both. And so that's one of the reasons I'm worried about it, because I think as I see these big gender gaps in mainstream education opening up, then I think it makes it even more important that we have alternative routes, alternative learning paths. And it turns out that that's also very important to the task of helping boys and men, especially those from working class backgrounds or lower income backgrounds, who are probably not going to succeed through the current higher education system and need high quality alternatives. So if it tilts male, I wouldn't have said this a few years ago, tilts male, I'm here for it.
Good stuff. Okay, let's open up some questions from the floor. I've got post-it notes all through this book, so I've got loads more. So if you don't...
By the way, thank you for what you said about it being a policy wonk stream. The nicest review I've had was from Matthew Iglesias, who's a economist, and he wrote a long review, and he said, Reeves, it was a nice review. Reeves' book is earnest, bordering on banal. And I went, yes. And my wife was in the room at the time. She said, what are you celebrating? I said, look what Iglesias said about my book. He said, it's earnest, bordering on banal. She said, well, that's not going on the front of the paperback. But it's exactly what I was going for, because I want that tone. I think it's incredibly important that when we discuss these gender issues, we do it in that earnest.
And I think it really does, the kind of section in the middle that recognises the intersections with both class and race. There's clearly thought put into. There are going to be some very strong criticisms to this argument. It's necessary to take those at their best, right?
Absolutely.
And I think,
try and take all the arguments at their best.
Yeah.
That's what Mill would want.
Indeed. Okay, let's go for some questions from the floor. So let's go Genevieve and then...
So you said that young men are crying out for a script, and that Andrew Tate offers one example of it, pretty horrendous as it is.
Yeah.
So yes, I can kind of agree with that it's all over the place, but then who decides what the right script is? But do you have different scripts for different people, different groups in society?
Yeah, it's a great question to which I don't have a very good answer. And it's honestly something that, especially the piece I wrote about Tate, I said something like, he's providing a script, and if we don't like his, then we should be providing a better one. To which the editor came back and said, well, A, who's we, and B, what is it? I didn't have great answers to either. But I do think that, so it's not going to be, any script we have, I think it's true for femininity too now, is not going to be as prescriptive, if I can risk repeating the word, as it was in the past, and that's good. Right? But I do think there's something to be said for a cultural conversation backed by policy which recognises some differences and which leans into the positive aspects of them, like fatherhood. That's why I lean quite hard on fatherhood. Like some of these differences in learning styles, like some of the opportunities for boys and men to be in spaces where they are with older men or with other men that are in male-only spaces. Now, that's not writing the script down and said, hey, be like this, be a good father, be courageous, be courteous, etc. Here's the script. Although it's interesting, I was at the Church of the Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City, and they gave me the script for masculinity that they have all their young men read out, and it wasn't bad actually. There's some pretty good stuff in it, and it was about responsibility and all that stuff. So I think it's got to be built around, as I said, I'd start with fatherhood, and it would start with respect, but it would also have to recognise. Partly it would be about not what we don't say, so it would be about not being careful about things like toxic masculinity and all that kind of stuff too. And partly it would be about just making sure that we have spaces within which, even if it's not spoken, the scripting is done. I think that's where mentoring schemes, boys and men's clubs, things like the Boy Scouts movement, which just went co-ed, which I think was a mistake, do provide places where there are promises and and structures and there were Scouts does provide a kind of script, so we should be supporting those kinds of institutions. That's the best I can do right now.
Isn't that bring backery though? Why are you saying bring backery though?
That's a great challenge. Yeah, I am a little bit. Yeah, and to that extent, I'm a little bit conservative on some of these things. I have come to appreciate the roles of institutions and scripts and guardrails more than I would have done before, and it's partly because of this work, because I think this, and I'll still use this language for the moment, I think this sense of scriptlessness, or Mead's sense of kind of like learned nurturing behaviour, I do think this cultural learning is incredibly important, and I think that liberals of my stripe, the best criticism of us is that we make too much presumption that they're just going to continue without paying attention to them. And I'm less confident of that than I used to be. And obviously that's partly because of political events of recent years too. I think has really made a lot of, a million liberals go, wait, we actually need to work harder to maintain some of these institutions that we did.
Other questions and thoughts? There was one there, and then I'll go back there.
Not him, he doesn't know anyone who doesn't know Andrew Tate is not allowed to ask questions.
So, this book seems to be about the impact that improved women's rights has had on traditional gender roles. The obvious sequel would be on the impact of improved gay rights on traditional gender roles. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts at the moment on that phenomenon.
Yeah, so I should just add that I also talk a lot about the economic changes in the labour market, which I think are independent of the change in the economic relations between men and women. So putting it very simply, men, particularly working class men, have been disproportionately hit by changes in the labour market anyway, right? So, and that's not because women have done better, it's because of other forces, but it's happened simultaneously. So there's been this coincidence of an economic shock, but then also, if you like, a kind of cultural shock from this kind of massive change in their relatives. That's why it's about absolute and relative status. I basically just go right past the question about LGBTQ by saying, right. Actually, I just got criticised for this in a conservative review. Just says, basically saying Reeves is still just a liberal feminist. He's just hiding it better. I said it's a book that uses terms like cis heterosexual, right? Which I do. I say that right at the beginning. Say this book is aimed at the 95% of men who are. Right. That doesn't mean that there aren't still issues for the other 5% of men who define themselves differently, but it is just to say, look, for the vast majority of men who are straight and who do define themselves in line with their natal birth, their cis, the world has changed very dramatically as a result of some of the changes moving forward. Otherwise, I just park it. It's not that there isn't. It's not that there aren't plenty of people paying attention to those issues. There are. They're getting plenty of attention, as they should. Don't mistake me, but we shouldn't have a discourse that forgets about the 95%. And so this book basically just focuses on the only slight exception to that is I criticise the right a little bit for weaponising the LGBT thing, like the whole bathroom stuff, which you probably, I don't know if you followed this, but just became a whole thing in the US. So the reactionary right here are weaponising some concerns about gender roles by kind of taking the LGBT thing, blowing it out of proportion, and so it's become a real culture war thing. It's not. I don't think it's working very well. I think the midterms helped to show that. But it became a real thing in the culture wars. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I do think that, as a social scientist, the increasing number of single-sex couples with children, almost all women, by the way, women much more want to have children in a single-sex relationship than men, does allow us to look quite hard, to learn more about the labour market. But other than that, I can recommend 48 other books to address those issues.
Let's take a kind of cluster of questions. So I'm going to go for those three there, kind of in that line. So let's start with you and then we'll move backwards.
Thank you. You call yourself a liberal.
I do.
But you've basically said the liberal economic model hasn't served men well, even if it is coincidental to some extent. So what sort of facets would an economic model have that you think would help improve that situation for men, if it's not just beyond technical education, vocational, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
If a successful marriage or long-term relationship requires one to be both good at dancing and surviving multiple proverbial shipwrecks, shouldn't it feature more centrally in the work you do?
Good. And then,
Hi, thanks. I'm a big fan of the podcast. I should begin by saying.
Thank you.
I wanted to push more on the question on progressivism and traditional gender roles. Well, not even traditional gender roles, but actually fundamentally what it means to be a man. You mentioned Louise Perry, but obviously, she's also taken a particular view in her book on sex realism and that debate, and I think it's more broader than the simple bathroom debate.
Yes.
Don't you think that by dodging that issue, for good reason, which I'm sympathetic to, you kind of don't have a good, or at least you kind of weaken the argument, because the whole issue of what it means to be a man in its very essence is up for question. And if you just say, well, let's just leave it to these crazies to fight over, you kind of don't get to the meat of it. And just on Louise's point, sorry.
No.
Is she right? Is it the case that the sexual revolution hasn't just impacted women, but also has negatively impacted men, if what you're saying about marriage and fatherhood is true?
Okay, so we've got three quite big questions
Yeah.
there. So what's the kind of post-liberal economic model?
Yep.
Just if you could do that in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Question on marriage and its importance in
Yes.
kind of buttressing some of those things, and then a question about kind of the definitional kind of what is a man, and questions about sex realism. So those three.
Okay, great questions. Great questions, and succinct as well, so I really appreciate that. So I'm still a liberal, broadly speaking, when it comes to economic policy. I do think that the consequences of many of our economic policies, and immigration, by the way, that would be in the bucket of these changes. I would count that in economic policy for sure. That we were complacent. I'm against complacent liberal economic policy. And when I think back to it, and I'm absolutely talking about myself here, as well as all the other people around, in that sort of centrist, Blairite, Clintonite place, is that we knew that on net and in the long run, all these things are good for the economy. But kind of forgetting the fact that, wait, on net in the long run means that right now somebody specific is getting screwed. And so we talk about lifelong learning, a phrase that I've now banned from my own team. Like, no one's allowed to say lifelong learning. We never actually did anything about it particularly, but we just kind of presumed it would sort of come out and it'd be okay, and anyone who was against it was probably, there was something wrong with them in some way. I look back and I'm really quite, I think I did a thing for The Economist, short thing on respect, and I actually think that there was a profound disrespect on the part of the policy-making class that I would absolutely count myself among, for those who were bearing the brunt of the changes that we were bringing about. Now, doesn't mean we shouldn't have brought about the change. We could have done more slowly in some cases, not least the EU immigration story. I think it's pretty clear now that Blair made a mistake. But also there just should have been much, much more investment in compensatory policies and helping people to adjust, etc. I think we're kind of lifelong learning. You get with the program, human capital, you'll be good. You know, listen to Bill Clinton, and you listen to Bill and Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and it all sounded so great. And you're like, shit. You know, fast forward, it took a while for us to reap what we sowed, but I honestly do think we did. So I think yes, we can have. I'm still pro-immigration, still pro-free trade, etc. I genuinely think we have to be very careful about industrial policy. It has to be done at quite a high level, for sure, because the costs are too high. But by God, we just didn't compensate the losers of the changes we were bringing about. That's my big change, and there should be much more redistribution and investment in the people who are losing it. The question goes about successful marriage. Yeah, actually, one of the things that Kay Heimowitz, who's a Manhattan Institute scholar, said at an AI event I was at a couple of weeks ago, really stuck with me, where she said, the thing about these modern marriages, because they're more egalitarian, is that they take a lot more negotiation, they take a lot more relationship, a lot more skill. Like when you knew what your job was, if your job was to come home, come home, and your job was there, it was clear, you didn't need that much negotiation. There wasn't. And so her view was that actually those skills, those relational skills, have become much more important. And so if there are gaps, by class or background, in those skills, that's actually going to make it even harder. So her basic point was, these modern marriages are hard. They require high levels of skills. So I agree with you about that. And so I do think that if there's evidence that these skills can be taught, I'm not sure how good the evidence is, that absolutely we should be promoting them. But I would say that for me, that gets absorbed into some of my discussion about fatherhood, because it turns out that the overlap between the parenting skills and marital skills is quite strong. It's my read of the evidence anyway. And so developing relational skills is absolutely critical for being a good father, as well as a good mother, of course. But I also think it'll have these spillover effects into helping you be a better partner. And so to the extent that those can be taught in one way or another, they absolutely should. What I wouldn't do is build it around marriage. All marriage promotion policies in the US have completely failed. It's just something you can't get at directly. You can't promote marriage directly. What you can do is create circumstances in which relationships could flourish. But as I said earlier, I'm father first, not marriage first, because what I look at, when I look at marriages that are strong, particularly among those with more levels of education, I see them as, I'll say this unromantically, they're joint ventures for co-parenting. They're a completely new model of marriage. They're not about the marriage of economic dependency or a clear division of labour. They're much more about, we're going to raise kids together, we want to do it really well, so let's form a joint venture, which is one of the reasons why you see an increase in divorce rates after the kids grow up now. I think that's a really strong, that's quite interesting evidence that it's a parenting enterprise now, which leads me to think that if people got more serious, especially when fathers got more serious about parenting and fathering, it might lead to more marriage. But I think it'll be that way around. I don't think we're going to we can't get men, we're not going to bludgeon men back into being fathers through marriage. We might bring back, I shouldn't say bring back, we might see more marriage if we do more fathering. And then, look, is Louise right about sex? Look, there's a chapter that's not in the book, but was written, which is about sex. And my publisher said to me, if you have a chapter about sex, no one is going to ask you about vocational education. I think that even if I had, you would still have asked me about vocational education, right? So this is maybe the one place in the world where that would be true. And even so, I've still fielded a lot more questions about Tinder than about technical high schools, because it obviously is so important. I didn't address those issues because I'm a policy wonk, and I tried to restrict my focus as far as possible to areas where I felt like there was at least something sensible to be said about how policy could be brought to bear. It's also why I'm not very good on the script stuff yet, because I don't think it's largely a policy story. And I wanted to use my position at Brookings and my kind of the nerdy stuff to just help create the space for a debate about this, which was a bit more nerdy, was a bit more boring. As soon as you start talking about sex, and has the sexual revolution failed? It's like game over. No one wants to talk about anything else, right? And it's not clear to me what the policy implications would be, with one or two exceptions, which I will be willing to share a little bit. I think Louise is right. Louise, for those who don't know, Louise Perry, but there's many others. There's like 3 books recently. Louise's book, Erica Bakioki's book, and the woman at Washington Post whose name escapes me. But anyway, all about sex.
Emma.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Christine Ember's book. 3 books about sex from women, all saying, yeah, I'm not sure this whole thing's working out for us very well. So there is obviously, there would be an interesting book to be written from a kind of more progressive perspective from the point of view of men. Where they're right is to say one of the clearest differences between men and women is in terms of their orientation towards sex. And one of the tasks of societies is to help us to make that a good difference, not a bad difference. This is back to acceptable at a dance. It is crazy to deny it. And the question then is like, well, what kind of, how do we calibrate it? What does it look like? And what they're really criticising is the idea that the way to solve this is for all women to feel like they should be like men when it comes to sex. And they're rebelling against that. And good for them, because that doesn't strike me as particularly feminist. But what does it mean for boys and men? Is a question that I don't think we're addressing properly yet, except for some sort of moral panics about porn, which are largely misplaced in my view. But I do think we should need porn education in schools, and that would be a good space to have maybe separate classes. You know, I think not educating our boys about porn is just a massive failure, given that it's absolutely everywhere. And so that's and that's an example, I think, of just sort of recognizing that, like, boys and men are going to be, accessing, probably consuming porn, like just flat, ubiquitous. You can't do good research on porn anymore because there just there's no control group. It just isn't. It really isn't. And so just sort of saying, hand waving about that, or being sort of moral panic about that doesn't help at all. We just got to say, yeah, well, of course. Like, nobody really thought about human nature for very long. Would be surprised at how ubiquitous porn is. It's not a new thing. It's just been weaponized. It's just been amplified by the internet. So that's one example of how we should think about it. Other than that, the chapter remains on the cutting room floor for now.
Very good. Let's take a few more. We've got a question back there. Any others? Question here at the front. Okay, we'll take those 2 for now. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for coming. I listened to you on the Andrew Sullivan podcast, which prompted me to come. You just mentioned that one avenue would be to make marriage more equated with fatherhood and parenthood in general.
Yeah.
With that in mind, do we need to update the legal system and custody and separation law, which sort of treats the mother still as pretty much the primary caregiver and the father more as the sort of economic unit?
Excellent, thank you.
Hi, I think I'm just curious to know what your thoughts on pay transparency rules are. That's been introduced in New York quite recently.
Yeah.
In terms of the varying impacts it has on men and women.
Excellent, thank you. And any question? Otherwise, yeah.
Just to go back to the institution point, and you talk about the Scouts being a good institution, or previously a boys-only institution. What are your views on kind of single-sex schools and whether they might either help or hinder a kind of modern masculinity, or how men interact with women?
Right, thank you.
So sort of custody, pay transparency, single-sex school.
Well, actually, here I'm very interested to learn, and maybe people in the room will know more. Is it still true in the UK legal system that there's a strong bias in favour of mothers? It's not really true in the US anymore. Varies by state.
I have absolute personal, but through sort of friends and family, you still have to, as a mother, be like a member of the Gaddafi family, not to get a biased assessment.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
That's one way of phrasing it.
that's a pretty clear bar there, you said. Well, so I'm not up to date with the UK. I mean, I know that there was a review during the coalition, which honestly I would need to be updated with. So some of them really can update me. But the progress seemed to be pretty good as far as I could tell. And I went to the US legal system. I was really pleasantly surprised. Like, after divorce now, fathers get a third of the time with kids. There's very few sole custody. Some states are way ahead of others. But they used to. I think one of the justices, a couple of decades ago, said, "Well, he was a Georgia district court judge, I think. He said, I ain't never seen a calf following a bull. So whenever I have a case, I always give custody to the mom." All right. Well, that's not true anymore. Thank God. So actually, the divorce system seems to be working quite well. Where it doesn't work very well, and again, I have no idea what the comparison is, it doesn't work very well for unmarried parents. Now, of course, the UK has civil partnership as an alternative, and what's super interesting is, of course, now you can have a civil partnership if you're straight as well. So there's a fantastic social science experiment going on all around us right now to see what are the outcomes for straight couples in civil partnerships as married. Anyway. So, but my basic position is, I look at the system and there should not be a presumption in favour of one or the other. I mean, if you go back in time, of course, there was a presumption in favour of the father, right? And then came in the mother. There shouldn't be. It should be best interest of the child with a strong presumption of equal rights and equal custody. And if you can do that in the divorce, of course, you're absolutely for unmarried fathers as well. So the problem in the US is just unmarried fathers are not treated very well. And it's two separate systems as well.
Can I just do a very quick follow-up?
Of course.
For the child, do you think it's beneficial for them to have completely equal custody?
Yes.
Or is it? Yeah.
Everything else equal, yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah, I think that should be the presumption. The presumption should be equal custody. Like you need to be argued. So what I'd like to see in some states, a couple of states have even done this now in the US, is to actually make that the specifically articulated default. So that going into it, so then the judge has to decide why do I, and they have to justify deviating from the default. So I think the default should be equal joint custody. And then there may well be a reason not to do that. You don't live too close together, they're at school there, dad or whatever, right? Or you know, problems in the relationship, and there's all kinds, and so you're still going to have occasions where it'll be sole custody. But I would make that the legal default. Also, that sends a very strong message, I think. So I think it's good in and of itself, but it's also a very important normative message, which is, yeah, we think that it's incredibly important for kids to spend as much time with their dads as with their mums. The only exception might be the very, very early years. Like I think I'd probably feel a bit different about a 6-month-old than a 12-year-old. It's still, so that might be a reason to deviate from the default, right? I can imagine saying that, well, she's breastfeeding, say. Right, that might be a very good judicial reason to go into it. But I'm pretty clear about the egalitarianism. Pay transparency. I mean, my instinct is in favour of pay transparency. Is it working?
Very early rounds of introductions is quite new,
Right.
but I think they found that internally it's had equalizing effects. So a lot of previous discrepancies have come to light, but because of how uniquely that position's bargaining, it just means that collectively wage levels tend to fall.
Oh, interesting.
People have more power. Employees have more power.
Yeah. I think it has to be a really good reason not to do pay transparency. I'm pretty sure I did it when I was at Demo. And Brookings is having this conversation right now, and I'm one of the people arguing in favour of it. Because my basic presumption is if you can't justify, if you can't look your colleagues in the eye and justify why you're being paid more than them, then there's something wrong here. Whether or not companies can game it, or what the unintended consequences might be, I don't know. But I'm broadly in favour of it. I don't see any kind of strong privacy arguments against it. And single-sex schools, I looked at single-sex schools because a lot of people asked me to. That was your question, correct? And I just didn't see the evidence for effectiveness, really. This is US research. I don't know what the UK research suggests. There's some work from other countries, but I didn't see strong enough evidence that they were particularly beneficial to boys to justify a change in public policy. Let's put it that way. So I didn't see any evidence for harm. The huge problem here is just it's really hard to do good research on because the selection effects are obviously huge. The kind of parents choosing to send their kids to those schools, so and you can't. It's very hard to get random. It's just a very, very hard social science problem. But I came away from going, I'm not convinced. So it gets short shrift in the book. And certainly I wouldn't redesign the entire education system along single-sex lines. My proposal is to try and get at what I think might be lying behind some of the concern. So I do think that a lot of parents feel like the school system in general is not as boy-friendly as it could be. I think they're right about that. And so we need a lot more male teachers, for one thing. It's, I think, borderline scandalous that no one seems to care that we're just emptying our schools of male teachers and not think that's a problem. But I also propose starting boys in school a year later because boys develop later, especially in adolescence. Their prefrontal cortex just develops later. So they're actually at a neurological disadvantage on average. And so my conclusion is that we can go to the same school, but let's start boys a year later. Because I think what a lot of parents reacted to is there's just this maturity gap difference. And so that's one of the reasons to go to a single-sex school. But we could solve that by having different school starting ages for boys and girls, potentially.
probably goes on for a couple more questions, so if you have got something you want to jump in with, then this is the moment to do it. We'll go with the question there and then second question.
I want to pick up on the starting boys of the other.
Yes.
Do you actually think that's a good idea? And I
It's in my-
don't
it's in my
mean
book.
that in a
It's in my
sarcastic
book.
way. Like, if you could do that tomorrow,
No.
would you do it?
No.
Like, all the evidence suggests starting kids in school earlier, actually, if you look at really good early years education, Finland, Estonia, that's really successful.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in what you actually mean by that. Do you mean more sort of early years before actual school, a bit similar to what you have in different systems, or how you mean?
Yeah, so, well, what I say about this is that there are certain proposals I make in the book which if, assume I'm back in the US, if President Biden calls me up and says, read your book, I'm definitely going to do that, I'm passing a law to do that, there are some I'd go, yes, absolutely. So getting more men into the health and education professions, absolutely. More vocational training, get the apprenticeship bill through, absolutely. 1,000 new technical high schools, you betcha. More paid leave for dads, absolutely, Mr. President. I'm going to change a federal law to put all boys in school a year later. I'd be like, wait, just let's trial it first, let's evaluate it. It's a huge change, for sure. Although some of my critics say it's too small, but anyway, I can't figure, it's either massively radical or incremental, depending on which review you're reading. The reason I think it's worth trying and evaluating, and to be clear, I don't actually specify the way you achieve the staggered start. You could achieve it by starting girls a year earlier, not compared to the current default. Of course, the UK does start quite early by comparison to what countries in Europe, but there are various ways you could achieve it. The motivation for it is, first of all the descriptive evidence that just is this huge gender gap, and all the way through the education system now, you look at why is that? And I've become reasonably convinced that part of it is because of this maturity gap. And I mean maturity in this neurological sense, not in the, obviously it comes out in behaviour, but don't be so immature. I don't mean it that way. I mean just actually the brain science is quite clear that because girls hit puberty earlier, their prefrontal cortex grows earlier, so they get their act together earlier, basically. And so if that's true, why wouldn't we build that into the way we think about age? Age is a very, very crude proxy anyway. So why not, there's more overlap between one year and the next year than between boys and girls, for example, then why not just try and level the playing field by making the boys chronologically a year older, which would make them developmentally a bit closer. So if you think about it in terms of developmental age, in terms of chronological age, then there's quite a good argument for boys and girls starting at different time. When that is, whether it's 4 and 5, 5 and 6, I don't know. But as I said at the beginning, the thing I'd really want to evaluate it because it's not a free policy either. And the boys who benefit most are the ones from lower income backgrounds, whose parents want childcare concerns. So there's some complexity to it for sure. But I do think that it's an avenue worth pursuing. And when parents ask me about it, I say, well, if you're worried about it, then why not? It's not a race. Why not wait an extra year? And I looked at one, I didn't get this in the book, but I looked at some private schools in the US, and almost a third of their graduating class, the boys were a year old. So this is an open secret in private schools, certainly in the US, that it helps to have a late start.
Has your research crossed into at all the absence of male initiation in the West, and the idea of lots of other cultures having specific initiation ceremonies for males to sort of delineate a line between boy and man?
Not really. I mean, I've read, yes, people like David Gilmour, who I've read quite a bit of, and I cite in the book. He does quite a lot of work on that. But all the anthropologists, including people like Mead, Jeff Dench, a British sociologist, has written quite a lot about that too. And so, the reason I don't go all that deeply into it is for some of the reasons we talked about earlier, is because there's kind of a so what lurking behind it. And there was a danger that if you go too far into that stuff, it includes, and it's true the sex stuff too, it becomes a cultural commentary book. And I didn't want a cultural commentary book. There's lots of cultural commentary books about gender and sex and stuff. I really wanted a kind of earnest, banal, policy wonk stream book. I wanted a more boring book. And as soon as you get into that kind of stuff, you're speculating, B, you don't really know where it goes in terms of policy, and it's just like, here's a guy, here's what I think, right? I've just said some stuff about scouts, right? Probably because I was in the scouts. And I wasn't sure that I could stand any of it up enough empirically to be able to say anything that I felt good about in terms of the consequences of that analysis. And they didn't want to just be in the analysis business, they wanted to be in the solutions business. That said, since the book has come out, and as I've been kind of pushed and thought and talked more about this, I quoted me earlier, I talked about the script thing. I do think that to the extent that masculinity is more socially constructed, like when was the last crisis of femininity?
Probably the pill.
I mean, was that a femininity crisis? When was the last time there were headlines everywhere about the crisis of femininity? Probably the women's 70s?
It's kind of ongoing. It's the second shift thing about like women.
The Arlie Hochschild thing.
The joining in, but the needing to stay, the wanting to prove themselves as that role as the mother. Or
Yeah, but it doesn't have quite the same feel of a kind of collapse. It has more of a feel of like a stretch and overburden of kind of having to be more things at once. Is my sense of it, right? It's a superwoman thing. It's the right. You've got to be the CEO and look great and make great lasagna and choose the right lipstick and whatever, right? So it's just like you've got to be everything. It's more about like having to be everything, rather than the sense of a collapse in the very idea of femininity. I actually think there was a moment in the women's movement where there was a debate about that, and then it was kind of like we're going to turn against the idea of femininity. And I think the women's movement largely avoided that trap. That's my opinion. But masculinity is in crisis all the time, and so you don't have to go very far to find another crisis of masculinity. And I think what that speaks to, the fact that there's this constant throughout history, the sense of a crisis of masculinity, is all that speaks to for me is just this cultural knowledge that's quite fragile, has to be more constructed, that it has to be learned, that it has to be taught, and that so the mechanisms and institutions and ways that we do that are important to attend to. What does that mean? I think it means that because there aren't such clear markers for like coming of age, if you like, for men as there are for women, the how we do that as a society is quite important, and it's why I sound quite conservative on some of these things, like scouts or schools or whatever it is. I don't have a good answer to what those should be now, but I do think that we shouldn't assume that we don't need them. I just don't know what they are now.
Because it struck me that your Scouts comment and also the Latter-day Saints experience was kind of bordering on a shadow of what initiation might look like in today's society and a process through which...
Yeah, you said the labour market used to be a hugely important part of that. I mean, think about the fact that actually entering the labour market, becoming an earner, and to some extent becoming a breadwinner, and so on, those used to be hugely important rights that were somewhat distinctly masculine under conditions of sexism. And so to the extent that that's no longer a distinctly masculine right of passage because of the success of the women's movement, which is, to be clear, fantastic. It does mean that there isn't like this different way, right? So when I think about my own parents who had a very egalitarian marriage, there's no question that for my dad, like the breadwinner of getting into the labour market was a hugely important kind of marker for him, whereas for my mum, like being a mum was definitely more of a marker, right? Not that she didn't work, not that my dad didn't father, all of that, but in terms of the journey, in terms of the past, no question that was true. So if you take the labour market one away as distinctly, then I do think it might actually mean that it's even more important to find alternatives to that, just at the moment where I think, if anything, we're kind of running away from some of them. And so I've now come to believe that we should be working harder in those non-labour market areas of society, family, civil institutions, etc., partly by way of compensating for the loss of them in the labour market. And so I don't have a great script. I didn't give a good answer. I don't have policy proposals. I'm in full in cultural commentary mode at all this point. I do think probably just engaged fathering is a big part of it, actually. Kids believe their eyes, not their ears. And so I do think part of this scripting and initiation is just can happen quite naturally through fathering, but only if the father is engaged.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's wrap it up there. So it's firstly probably very important to say Richard has a book out that you may be aware of, that you should all purchase.
Bloody buy the book.
Go and buy that book. Go and buy it on. There we go. Buy it on bookshop.org. Seriously, where if you buy things that money goes to independent bookstores, don't buy it from the other unnamed large.
Very good.
Don't buy it from there.
I don't care where you buy it. To be clear, I am a liberal when it comes to the.
Fair enough. Richard, thank you so much for coming in and chatting to us. Really appreciate it. A book that really speaks to some of what we do at Onward. Really grateful for your time. Thank you very much for everyone for coming. Keep your eyes out for more of these events, more of these discussions. But for now, thank you, Richard. Let's give
Thank
him
you
a
to
round
you
of
for your
applause.
questions, and
Thank
to
you.
you for coming and for your questions too. Appreciate it.
Thank you.